Hey, Brian, what's up?
Not man, just on the WWE Network checking out Barely Legal '97 from ECW.
Man, those guys were good.
Yeah,
And
man,
talented, really ahead of its time.
it was. I'm surprised at how well it holds up even all these years later. I can't believe it's been so long. But it makes me think, man, like, what if ECW didn't go extreme back in '93?
Well, it really, what would that have done to wrestling in general as a whole?
I guess there's only one way to find out.
Don't forget the sucks capacitor.
In an era where wrestling sucks, two men will scour wrestling's infinite realities to find out what could have been. While the sucks capacitor harnesses the bad, explore Brian and Sheldon's wrestling multiverse.
All right, so ECW went extreme in 1993, taking Eastern Championship Wrestling to Extreme Championship Wrestling. And everyone knows the effect that it had on the wrestling business. Um, you pose a really good question, Mr. P. If
I always do,
if
Brian.
ECW wasn't extreme, would we have just seen the same old Memphis stuff, the Memphis rehash that Eddie Gilbert was trying to present in Eastern?
It obviously probably wouldn't have gone national.
Yeah, it really fit in with the whole time. And to be honest with you, I think someone would have. Let's backtrack. I think the way TV was with Jerry Springer, and then you had a lot of just general attitude with music and everything during the mid to late '90s. I think someone would have stumbled on the reality TV concept, almost like Bischoff and WWF did. Um, but it is interesting to think of if the hardcore like weapons aspect of it would have been the same, or if it would have, you know, gone that far.
Well, and not only that, think about where a lot of the later '90s WCW and WWE guys came.
That's true. Would they have been like? Could you imagine Al Snow never finding Head and been stuck as Avatar and leave Cassidy for the rest of his career?
Right. Or Mike Awesome.
The fat chick thriller, that '70s guy.
Right.
Um, yeah, I'm trying. There's a ton of guys like Shane Douglas. He could have been Dean Douglas, or and if it wasn't for ECW and him bumping up with Funk, he would have never turned heel, because he was always that plucky young babyface, and he could have had a run in the WWF, might have had a run maybe in WCW. That probably would have been more up his alley. But to be honest, we probably would have seen Hogan versus the Dungeon of Doom forever and ever, amen.
Well, not only that, I mean, if you really think about it, uh, with the creation of reality based storylines, would you end up with just a 7 foot tall, overrated Vegas lounge singer?
Yeah, dude, like Vinny Vegas. Well, no, because he was Diesel in the WWF. And see, that's the other thing, too, is I know ECW was innovative. And I know they really pushed the envelope and forced everyone's hand. But at the same time, from what I've heard in interviews, a big issue with what the Click, like, idealistically, the Click would have liked to go in a more reality based adult direction. I've heard Hall and Nash say that the stuff they started doing in WCW was the stuff they were fighting for in the WWF. But with guys like Brett around, they wanted it to continue to be black and white, good versus evil. You can't say this, you can't do that. So, you know, if that had happened, how long would it be? Because one could argue there would have been no NWO if it wasn't for ECW.
Well, absolutely, but I mean, really, not only NWO would there be a DX.
Absolutely. Because if there was no NWO, there probably wouldn't be a DX.
Because for the most part, most of the Attitude Era style Monday Night Wars era factions were mostly just a combination of the Triple Threat and the Nest in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it was like one big branching storyline for a while. But, I mean, let's think about the guys, first of all, who were staples of ECW and really had careers because of that style change. You mentioned Raven. They might not have allowed Raven to be the Raven character. He could have been, Johnny Polo goth style. Sandman may have still been a Sting surfing knockoff and never been the beer swilling, Dick the Bruiser type that he ended up turning into.
Absolutely. Well, and look at stunning Steve Austin.
True, yeah.
Stunning Steve Austin got fired from WCW and spent, what was it, like 8 months?
Something like that, yeah.
Out in Philly.
And he was able to be himself and express himself. And that came through, and you saw those early shades of Stone Cold. And there you go, Stone Cold. That never would have happened if it wasn't for ECW, because he would have never thought to present himself in that fashion if he hadn't gone through that area.
Well, and not only that, you want to talk about reality-based storylines. Dreamer and Raven.
Yeah, Dreamer still would have been, suspenders with the baggy pants getting booed out of Philly.
Absolutely.
And a lot of those guys, not even just the characters, they owe their careers to the hardcore matches, because it was able to give a lot of guys a Band-Aid to cover up, shortcomings, as far as like Axl Rotten never had a great physique, was a good worker, but he could never get the attention because in 93 to 95, it was still, even though they were reeling from the steroid trial, they were still pushing other guys. Either they were smaller and faster, or they were bigger and, built pretty well. And Axl was that
bigger and slower.
Bigger and slower, that's right. Your least favorite combination in wrestling.
Absolutely.
But, Axl would have been lost in the shuffle. He would have just, imagine if he was his Johnny Rotten gimmick that he did in WCW.
Oh, yeah. Ball.
Those guys would have been like Man Mountain Rock in WWF.
Absolutely. Or the Godwin. Who knows?
Oh, true. And I think that's, you had Dungeon of Doom, or you had, as a friend Ben of mine likes to say, another Ben, he likes to say, there's an era of wrestling where everyone had a second job. One was a plumber, one was a prison guard, although the Big Boss Man was a cool gimmick in the late 80s.
Dentist.
What was that?
For the love of all things good and holy, we can't forget the dentist.
Isaac Yankem. So, yeah, we ostensibly would have had just an eternal turnover of bad, trade-related gimmicks if it wasn't for ECW slapping the shit out of the business.
Well, really, if you think about it, because if given the chance, that Vince McMahon and Bruce Pritchard would have turned Balls into a caveman.
Captain Caveman. Was that one of their plans for him?
Well, no, he always just kind of had that look to him.
True. And, well, he was, Santa Claus before he was Balls Mahoney.
Yeah, and he had that big head, and the when his hair wasn't wet and was down, it was big and poofy. And he kind of looked like a caveman.
He did. Um, Here's a big question. What about Sabu? Because the Sheik influenced him, and Sabu was doing hardcore stuff before ECW really embraced that. So where would he have wound up in that? Would he have just been another junior heavyweight brought into WCW as a cruiserweight, but not played ball and kind of been stuck in either Puerto Rico or Japan?
I would just think that it would just be FMW.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
He'd just stay. He'd do what every other hardcore guy did. Stay in FMW.
Yeah, and I forgot all about that because Onita and those guys were pioneering hardcore in Japan. So we could have seen, instead of guys getting big breaks in the WWF and in WCW for it, there could have been a lot more guys going to Japan or staying in Japan. So like Funk and Foley might have had extended runs there. Sabu might have gone there for an extended period of time. Trying to think of whoever else who embraced that. Maybe Axel, Rotten, and Balls would have gone to Japan. But it seemed like that was a lot more ultra-violent than what even ECW was doing. So that's even hard to say, too.
Well, because like it makes you wonder how, if you really go deep into it, how does that go ahead and affect Montreal?
Yeah, because... But was that about the tone and direction, or was that just about the problems between Shawn and Brett? I'm sure that made it worse, but...
Because, and I'm a fan of both guys, but you know, Brett didn't like where Shawn wanted to go.
Sure.
Whether they had issues or not.
Well, yeah, because I would be a hypocrite to question that, because I just mentioned that part of the reason the Clique had with Brett was because he was old guard and wanted to do things the old ways. Plus, they might not have gone with Vince McMahon, as the owner coming out of it, feuding with Austin. You know what I mean? Because before then, Vince was just the announcer.
Right.
And if there was an issue with Hogan and the boss, they never addressed it.
Well, they did. They just used Tunney.
True. But they kept everything as if, backstage was separate. But that's the other thing, too, is where does the audience pulling WWE, or WWF at the time, pulling WCW toward, we want a more adult, a more realistic presentation, where does that compete with the stuff ECW was doing? Because Paul Heyman can say all he wants that everyone stole from ECW. We're the only reason that they had as success as they did because they embraced our formula. Well, if you looked, like I said, Jerry Springer was like the number one show on cable. And you started getting bands like Limp Bizkit and Eminem and all of these, and Kid Rock, these super rebellious acts in even music that were kind of fed up with the whole fake friends. Hey, we're all upper middle class and we live in New York City in these apartments, and gee golly whiz, we're all having fun while we laugh and talk at the coffee shop. It was like, no, fuck you, Marilyn Manson.
Absolutely.
Blair Witch Project. So where does that, where pop culture was going, because wrestling used to follow pop culture and try to match with what was going on. where does that compete with ECW's influence? You know what I mean? Because I think someone would have gotten there. Would they have gotten there as fast? Probably not. Would they have... Well, even more important from that, they probably wouldn't have the ready-made acts or talent pool, or even some of the writers and producers that they got, because ECW would not have been supplying that type of content.
Absolutely.
They might have been, leaning more on Val Venus. Well, I don't know. See, that's another thing too, is you start thinking about what ECW Hardcore was. And Rick Rude was doing stuff like that in ECW in 97 before Val Venus was even a part of the WWF.
Absolutely.
So are we both kind of on the same page that it would have still been like a let's say a more grown-up version of Dungeon of Doom versus Hulkamania?
I don't know that it would...
Or at least still as cartoony, because we still had Mankind and The Undertaker in 1996 before you had Attitude.
True.
But Mankind wasn't an extension of Mick Foley. It was, and let's remember, for anyone who doesn't know, Mick Foley's, the character Mankind, was originally a former child, a piano-playing child prodigy whose mom used to, show him off for her friends but ignore him. And he realized that the only thing that his mom liked about him was being able to play the piano for her friends and make her look good. So he smashed his hand with a hammer. And then she locked him in the basement. And that's why he had the mandible claw. So
I completely forgot about that.
Yeah, dude. It was those Mick Foley, man, say what you want. I know we gave him the Golden Waffle a couple years ago on our year-end awards for the B show. But that dude was so ahead of his time and such an incredible influence on the wrestling business himself. Just, ugh.
Absolutely.
I would take one Mick Foley over two Triple H's any day.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the other thing. So let's look at what a potential WWF and a potential WCW and a potential ECW card might have looked like had they not gone extreme. And let's say 1997, when everyone's kind of embracing this whole philosophy. Let's say, what would an ECW card have looked like in 1997?
I mean, I think you still end up with... Now, just so that we're on the same page, and other memories are, my memory is right. The Todd Gordon Eddie Gilbert fight was before that.
Correct, but kind of spurred on by Paulie. Because, well,
whether they win or not, Eddie Gilbert's still out of the booking picture.
Correct, it was Paul at that point. Because it all started with the Public Enemy.
Did it start with Public? Did it start with?
You're breaking up, but I think I know what you meant. I thought it was Public Enemy, and then started sprinkling in Shane, kind of getting more attitude, and then Sabu. So like those three.
Right, because I think it depends on in that case your definition of it, because it's Sabu and Shane if you're looking at Sabu and Public Enemy if you're looking at using weapons and being out of your ever-loving mind. and it's more Shane of I'm not gonna be Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan. We're gonna do things our way. So I think you pretty much just have more of that same. I think you end up with that same outdated, incredibly old timer territory system where, you look at some of the Eastern Championship Wrestling cards and they had like Terry Gordy.
Right. Superfly Snuka.
Snuka. And I think
Don Morocco, Tito Santana.
Yeah, like guys like that who you don't even remotely associate with ECW normally, except for maybe Terry Gordy.
So to be fair, it would still probably be a regional thing. So you'd probably still see maybe a Greg Valentine.
Yeah.
Maybe a Carlos Colon.
I would think so. Yeah, I could see that.
And you would probably let's just take the Raven Dreamer feud. You would have maybe Scotty Flamingo as a chicken shit heel versus or Johnny Polo versus plucky babyface Tommy Dreamer with the suspenders.
Right, but then are they still fighting over Summer Camp in Beulah?
No, they wouldn't be.
So what are we basing the feud on then?
Or they could be, but except in this case, you would probably have Tommy Dreamer, oh shucks, with a... No, because you probably wouldn't want to put a girl that attractive with a gee golly whiz babyface anyway.
Well, they did it with... Well, I guess they were kind of both portrayed that way. Never mind.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I guess they kind of did that with Spike and Molly, but they didn't.
Yeah, because they were both. They were both.
That way.
Yeah, they were presented as goofballs. Shit, just yeah, it's just so hard to picture because it's so different. But it'd be safe to say it'd be a mix of like guys who are past their prime, and then like a Scotty Flamingo instead of Raven. Suspenders Dreamer. You would probably still have you'd probably still have Surfer Sandman,
which is still weird to think about.
Yeah, could you imagine Surfer Sandman versus let's call it Greg the Hammer Valentine for the Eastern Championship Wrestling title?
No.
Or maybe plucky Shane Douglas. Who's a heel? Okay, who would either a big heel of the time
in ECW or in general?
Well, I guess you would have to look at Shane because he was really the only other one. It was him and Raven, really.
Well, I mean,
so maybe. Sorry, what's up?
Dancing Stevie was a heel before Raven.
Yeah. But was he really like top? I'm saying like second to the top act. Maybe Funk. Maybe heel Terry Funk. The aging, maybe similar to what he was doing in WCW or the NWA in the late 80s. Just doing the same thing in ECW versus plucky young Shane Douglas.
Right. Oh yeah. Not to mention, I mean, really, you'd think that somebody would notice and they'd come over anyway, but Paul basically created the cruiserweight.
True. And
They had the working relationship with Mexico before Eric did.
right.
They got Jericho first.
Benoit, Malenko, Saturn. The whole backbone wrestling wise of WCW at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that was WCW theft number one, because there were two waves of WCW theft.
Can you still call it theft though? I mean, really, those guys weren't just going to ECW. They weren't. ECW was not their mecca. They were trying to get signed. You know what I mean?
I think maybe some more than others.
So let's look now at WCW. You don't have any of those guys. Ostensibly, they would have come over because Benoit had his Japan deal. And so did guys like Malenko and Guerrero. And WCW had an arrangement with Japan.
Right, yeah.
So that could have still happened there.
But then do you still have Ray and Psychosis?
Eventually, because what
In death matches in ECW in 95, 96.
did WCW have the Cruiserweight title before then? When was the Cruiserweight title really brought into the fold in WCW?
Well, Brian Pillman and Scotty Flamingo had the light heavyweight title in the early 90s. That was 92, 93.
Says 91, but that's probably your light heavyweight thing. Cruiserweight Championship 96.
Which would have been post. Which would have been, I think that's after the Ray and Psychosis ECW stuff.
March 20th, 96, Shinjiro Otani defeated Wild Pegasus to win what then became known as the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. So, Otani was did it say Otani was the first one or Benoit? Otani. So I'm sorry. I just read it. I was saying, did I say that? So Otani wins the light heavyweight title in 96. It becomes the cruiserweight title. And then shortly thereafter in 96, you have the influx of talent from Mexico and Japan. So, I mean, they were going in that direction.
Almost all of which, though, came through ECW. Through from ECW.
True, but again, if WCW had a working arrangement with Japan, and Eddie Guerrero was Black Tiger, Benoit was Wild Pegasus, Dean Malenko was there. I mean, they could have picked up more guys from Japan as opposed to just the cruiserweights from Mexico, too.
True.
You know? And you had Jericho was doing his stuff over in War, was it?
Yeah.
So Jericho was in War. So you still have that connection, although, no, that's a completely different promotion. That's interesting, too. Where would Jericho would have shuck out in this?
Right. Because that was U.S. #1 company was ECW.
And if you didn't have the NWO turning things more reality-based, you could have wound up with, maybe some of those guys from Japan as the Cruiserweight champion. But, again, without the Lucha influence, you might not have had it rise to the heights it was. It could have just been looked at as the TV title became. It's a stepping stone title for some of the smaller guys or some of the lesser-known guys. And instead of, the NWO, you could have just had, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash come back and being Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. I mean, they would have had a different attitude, but you would have had, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash working on top or, right below.
Right, but would they be Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, or would they be the Diamond Stud and Oz.
No, from what I've heard from those guys, there was no way they were going to go back to that.
Right, but they didn't. There was no real proof outside of ECW that that kind of thing would have worked.
Well, but that's part of the reason they left WWE or WWF. Oh shit. We got like 30 seconds.
Wrestling would have been much worse.
I love it.
I don't want to have to fix this thing, Brian.
I don't either.
You know how hard it is to find parts for this thing?
Yes, it's the only thing of its kind. Ugh. All right, the Sucks capacitor's about to blow. We got to get out of here. Maybe we'll revisit this down the road because I'm sure we could cover the WWF in depth. But I'm Brian J.
Sheldon Positive.
Oh, shit. Let's get out of here. See you guys next time.